right, so again, welcome once more. My name is Liz Reed for the Moore Memorial Library, and tonight's program is hosted by Together Yes and Progress Norwood in the library, and we are very pleased to have with us tonight Ian Cook from the Neponset River Watershed Association. I'm going to share my screen over to Susan for a quick introduction, so bear with us as we jump behind the curtain and you get to see the scene change. Okay, Susan.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. It's very exciting that we are finding a way to make this sustainability series happen. Great thanks to Neponset River Watershed Association and Ian Cook, and great thanks to Norwood Library. Just a note before we begin, Together Yes from the beginning of this series has had the policy that we will not discuss whether climate change is happening. That is a waste of time. Look out the window, drive by the hospital we used to have, or watch the news. So we don't discuss that. What we do discuss is what we might expect and what we need to do to slow its acceleration. And it is shown to be accelerating. So this is an important talk, and I'm grateful that Ian will come and join us for that. I'd also like to give you a quick hello from Kate Sibbing-Dunn, who is the director of Progress Norwood, which co-sponsors the sustainability series now. Thank you. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for coming tonight, and thanks to Ian for making the time. It's such a strange time for our community these days, and especially to be thinking about things that are concerning, right? It's sort of everywhere we turn. So I think it's really important and valuable for us to be conscious of and not necessarily take our eye off the ball when it comes to climate change, because we're overwhelmed with other issues. We do need to stop and take breaks and take time for ourselves, but we're glad to be focused on this. Katie Neal Rizzo is also on the call, and she leads up our green team. I just wanted to briefly tell you that if you're interested in finding out more about what Progress Norwood does with our green team or with our other teams, you can find us at progressnorwood.org, or you can email us at progressnorwood@gmail.com. So thank you again to the library and Ian, and that's about it. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Ian can take it away.
Hi. Let's see here. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for having me. Let's see if we can just get that started there. All right. So again, my name's Ian Cook. Can everybody hear me okay, or is it better if I hold my microphone up higher? Is that better? Nobody responded, so I'll take your word for it. My name's Ian Cook. I'm the executive director of the Neponset River Watershed Association, and we are a regional nonprofit organization that works in Norwood and 14 other communities. We've been around for a long time now, since 1967, and our focus has traditionally been on trying to restore fishable, swimmable water quality, trying to protect open space and natural areas, and trying to improve conditions for local wildlife. But increasingly, our organization is focusing on climate resilience issues. And I think, over time, this is going to become an issue that we're all very conversant with. And I like to start with this picture because, of course, this is an issue of global warming. It's an issue that has been around for really a very long time, arguably 50, some would say even 100 years. We've been aware of this potential problem. And for a long time, it's felt very distant. The notion of, it would be nice if it was a little warmer. And you sort of hear some of the scientific information talking about, a 2-degree increase in the temperature. It sounds vaguely pleasant. But I think there is a growing awareness of how serious a problem this is. And hopefully there will be, over the next few years, a growing political commitment to beginning to deal with it in a more substantial way. So that's the global picture. But of course, we are not a global organization. We're an organization focused on the Neponset watershed. So these are basically 14 cities and towns where basically the rain falls in this yellow area and ends up in the Neponset River and ultimately discharged to Boston Harbor. So about 330,000 people live in this watershed. About 120,000 people get some or all of their drinking water from groundwater sources in the watershed. We have many businesses, lots of open space, many streams. And Norwood, of course, gets a gold star for being the only community that is entirely inside the Neponset watershed. So when we talk about global warming, we know that there's warming right in there. So we know things are going to get hotter. And I think for many years, we've all been hearing about these very large scale sort of global climate models and what's going to happen to global average temperatures over the years. And historically, there's been a lot of debate about that, but it seems to be that people are more and more convinced that this is actually happening and is actually a serious problem. And the statistics bear that out. We've had, according to NOAA, we have had 43 years in a row of above average annual temperatures. And we've had 435 months in a row of above average monthly temperatures. 2019 was the second hottest year NOAA had ever recorded on the planet. And the 5 hottest years on record have happened since 2015. And I think increasingly people can just feel some of the change that's happening. And I think that accounts for some of the thinking. The other thing that's happened is the science has started to evolve from having a very global picture to starting to have what are called downscaled climate models, where we can really start to look more specifically at what is actually going to happen in Norwood, not merely across the globe. And what does, the notion of a 2-degree temperature change sounds not too dramatic, but in fact, the way that plays out on the ground really is pretty significant. So this slide is just to put it in context, this slide is showing NOAA's estimate of the actual and projected number of days per year above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Norwood. And on the left side of this graph, you can see the historic record. So the dark gray bars are the actual number of 90+ degree days per year since from 1950 to 2005, I believe it is. And then the gray area is sort of the model run backwards to kind of show the range of expected values. So really over that time, we expected an average of 7 or 8 days a year of higher than 90-degree weather. As you move into the right, you start to see the projection of what we're looking forward to in the future. And it takes a little bit to understand this graph. So the dark blue line in the center is sort of the average number of days we would have in a year. And you can see that average increasing by the time you get out to the end of the century, pushing up towards, 25, 30, maybe even more days a year of 90-degree plus weather. But the thing to understand is that just like the gray is on the left, is kind of the light gray is kind of the range of expected variability for temperature. The blue is the expected range of variability in the future. So by the time you get out to 2060, 2070, there are likely to be some years where we've got 65 days a year over 90 degrees or 70 days a year over 90 degrees. And the challenge here is that this also is very dependent on what happens with future emissions of greenhouse gases. How seriously do governments around the world and here in the United States take this challenge, and how do we decide to change our ways to address this problem? So with, all right. So with that temperature change, aside from it just being hotter, a lot of other things are going to change. And one of the biggest things that's going to change is weather. You know, we all sort of learned the water cycle in school when we were kids. And, you know, rain falls, it goes into the ocean, it evaporates, and then comes back down as rain or snow or what have you. And one of the challenges with a hotter world is that more heat means more evaporation and more moisture in the air. And in fact, already we've been seeing the average amount of rain we get in a year has increased significantly, 3-4 inches, maybe more. And that's just measured, not future. You know, scientists and others have looked at this, and this is just a map showing across the country how the frequency of heavy rain events has changed during the last 50 years or so. And the Northeast is actually the area that's seen the biggest shift here. So we're getting more rain, but we're not really getting more days of rain a year. We're just getting more larger rain events. So instead of you know, a lot of sort of light sprinkles, we're getting more heavy downpours. And we've seen that huge 71% increase in those heavy rain events here in the Northeast already. And that's a trend that is definitely going to be continuing as we go forward. And then the other thing to understand is that, so that's when I say heavy rain events on that previous chart, that's the sort of normal sized rain events. The other thing that has been happening in the Northeast is we've seen a really dramatic shift in the large rain events. You know, we used to talk about a so-called 10-year storm, the amount of rain that would typically fall during 24 hours, on average about once every 10 years, about a 10% chance of happening each year, or a 25-year storm, or a 100-year storm. And those numbers, you know, the actual values from the 70s to 2000 are on the left of this chart. So, you know, that about once every 10 years, we would get a 5-inch rainfall over 24 hours. And about once every 100 years, we would get a, you know, maybe an 8-inch rainfall. And you can see over time, these numbers are shifting dramatically. So, you know, what we used to think of as a 10-year storm is very rapidly becoming a 50-year storm. So, you know, instead of getting 4.5 inches of rain once every 10 years, we're now talking about getting 6 inches of rain every 10 years. And the 100-year figure is really stepping up from, you know, 8 inches to 11.5 or 12 inches. And that is really generating a lot more frequent severe flooding, and certainly probably better than anyone else in the area. Norwood understands this problem right now. You know, Norwood this summer experienced a very extraordinary event. You know, 4 or 5 inches of rain in about 90 minutes. You know, it occurred over a very small geographic area. It really overwhelmed downtown Norwood. Interestingly, because it was so short and so intense and so localized, it didn't cause a big flood in the Neponset River because it wasn't that much total water. It just fell on so fast on such a small spot that it really overwhelmed the town, certainly overwhelmed the hospital. I'm sure by now everybody's seen this picture, which is just an amazing picture of the doors inside the hospital giving way to those floodwaters. So those are the kinds of events we're going to be seeing more of, and we're going to frankly be seeing a lot more damage from those sorts of events. The ironic flip side is that we are also going to be experiencing more drought. So we're getting more rain overall, more big floods, but we're also going to have more periods of drought. It's definitely sort of an ironic twist. And it's really because a lot of what climate change is doing is it's driving extremes. It's you know, the average changes a little bit, but the range of situations you expect changes a lot. And of course, this summer, ironically, Norwood got flooded, but Norwood also experienced a drought, which the state has identified as a so-called extreme drought We've seen the Neponset River very, very dry. We've all heard a lot about extraordinary forest fires in the western US. I think there's not been very much coverage of the fact that it's actually been a pretty significant fire season here in Massachusetts. There have been almost 1,000 forest fires in Massachusetts. Most of them are obviously a lot smaller than what's happening out west. But we're not immune to that problem either. And it's also for the Neponset River, that's expressed as very low stream flow. This is actually a picture of the Neponset River in Norwood, right near, just downstream of Route 1, near the Staples on Route 1, if you know where that is. And if you're not used to looking at the river, it's a little hard to tell what's going on here, but really the river is only about 12 feet wide and 6 inches deep here, which makes it not so great for recreation, creates some real challenges with water quality. Certainly it's very hard on wildlife. Normally the river would be filling the whole riverbed area to that sort of green vegetation. And of course, in the spring, it would be up and over that green vegetation and actually extending off the left side of the screen. It's not so much a direct problem in Norwood, but another big impact of climate change, which relates to heat and water, is sea level rise. And there are various projections for what's going to happen with sea level. The more optimistic projections are for something like 2.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And then if emissions are higher, those figures go significantly higher to up towards 7 feet, or in this estimate, at least, this is the city of Boston's estimate that they're using for planning, up to maybe 10 or 11 feet. And if you followed some of the recent science about sea level rise, some of the things that they're discovering about glaciers and warm water underneath glaciers, there's real concern that some of the estimates around sea level rise may be too cautious on the part of scientists at this point. And while that's not directly, I don't think the sea level is going to get so high that you're going to have salt water washing into Norwood anytime soon. But it does raise all kinds of interesting questions in terms of, the engine of our regional economy sits right on the ocean in the city of Boston. And as that's impacted, that will undoubtedly have other kinds of side effects on the town of Norwood. This is just an example on the Neponset River. This is actually in Quincy. A couple years ago, we had an unusually high spring tide combined with a coastal storm back in January. This is actually behind the Adams Inn near Route 3A, if anybody knows that area. We got here to take this picture probably after the water had come down a foot from its peak, and certainly not as dramatic as the freshwater flooding event that happened in Norwood this summer. But the owners of these cars are not very happy. The owners of the Adams Inn is not very happy. And the prediction is for events of this magnitude to be happening very regularly, multiple times a year, as we get 50 plus years out into the future. So, those are some of the changes that we're going to expect locally. And why does it matter? One is that all of these changes are going to have really significant effects on human health. A lot of people don't realize that the number one most deadly kind of natural disaster we have in the United States, it's not floods, it's not hurricanes, it's not tornadoes, and assuming we don't treat pandemics as a natural disaster, which I suppose arguably they are, but the number one is heat. About 12,000 people a year get killed by heat waves. Heat can be very hard on the elderly, on the young, on people who are outside, working outside. It is definitely an aggravating factor for heart failure. It aggravates air pollution and affects people with respiratory problems. For people who have to work outdoors in very high temperatures, there's an increasing problem with kidney failure due to chronic dehydration. And of course, this heat does actually help to stimulate some of the potential infectious kinds of issues that we've seen, like Triple E and West Nile and Lyme disease. So definitely a challenge in terms of public health and mortality. And it's also important to bear in mind that very much like the current pandemic, the burden of some of these health issues is not equally distributed across society. You know, on the right is sort of a picture of a stereotypical leafy green suburb, and on the left is a more urban environment. And you can just from looking at the picture, you can see on the left we've got lots of pavement, no trees, highways, infrastructure, and you can just see that it's going to be hotter there. And in fact, some recent studies have been showing really interesting patterns that show that in low-income and minority neighborhoods that were subjected to redlining by the federal government back in the 30s, you can trace the redlining maps to modern-day heat maps of the urban heat island effect. And in the city of Boston, there's an average of, I believe it's 6 degrees. The summer high temperatures are an average of 6 degrees hotter in underserved minority neighborhoods, low-income minority neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s, as compared to more affluent neighborhoods in the city. And when you start thinking about, you know, each degree of additional heat has additional mortality and economic cost issues, especially for people who don't have the ability to, you know, make sure their house is better insulated. They may not have air conditioning. If they have air conditioning, they may not have enough money to run it as much as they need to. It can be a real challenge for those vulnerable populations. And the equity issues get even more stark when you start thinking about them on a global scale. You know, half of the emissions around the world, let me restate that. The top 1% of most wealthy people around the world have released twice as many emissions as the lowest 50%. And many of the people around the world are much more exposed to the consequences of warming that's already happening and that is coming. Of course, you know, our focus as an organization has traditionally been on a healthy river. And all of these changes, both to water patterns and to heat, are going to pose big challenges for the river and for our ecology and our local wildlife. You know, we're going to be seeing significant changes to the plants and trees that survive in our area. We're also going to be seeing, and we're already seeing, significant challenges with worsened water pollution due to high temperatures and low stream flows during drought. And one of the things we've been focusing on recently is trying to protect habitat for native brook trout that are actually that are much more populous in the Neponset watershed than almost any place else inside 495. And in fact, some of those trout are right in Trap Hole Brook in Norwood. The picture in the bottom right, of course, is one of these native trout. And these are sort of a keystone species in our streams, but they are very sensitive to temperature, and these increasing temperatures are going to challenge their ability to survive. And then, you know, last but not least, if you don't care about public health and you don't care about wildlife, there are still more reasons to care about climate change, which is climate change is really expensive. It's really going to strain our economy. It's going to reduce agricultural productivity. It's going to reduce just general productivity. It's going to lead to lots of infrastructure damage that has to be dealt with. And part of why I like this picture, this is obviously downtown Boston. The thing I mentioned sea level rise, you know, you can see the ocean there right behind Boston. Boston is a city that is not very high above the sea. And, you know, as climate change affects Boston, that is going to have all kinds of ripple effects to the economy in Norwood, to land use in inland areas, all kinds of economic challenges. So we have lots of problems, and the question is, what do we do about it? So I just wanted to bring you back to this temperature map. Really, and I think this really illustrates one of the most important things we need to do. This version of that map has overlaid on it not merely the lower emissions scenario we looked at before, which was the blue, but a higher emissions scenario. This essentially is assuming that humanity continues emitting more or less kind of business as usual. And while the prospect of living in the Neponset Valley when there's 35 days a year over 90 degrees isn't very appealing, the prospect of doing that when there's an average of 65 or 70 days over 90 degrees a year, and sometimes you might have as many as 100 or 105 days in a year over 90 degrees, it's really almost unimaginable. So the first thing we need to do about this is we need to change the trajectory of our emissions. Climate change, if we change the trajectory, climate change is going to be challenging. There's no way at this point that there is not going to be a substantial amount of additional climate change that creates substantial challenges. But if we don't bend that emissions curve, we're looking at situations that are going to be extremely difficult for communities to adapt to, with tremendous costs and impacts to the things we all care about. And I think one other thing that I think is important about this graph is we also have to remember that time is not on our side. I mean, we have been debating whether we should do something about climate change for at least 30 years very actively, and as a society, frankly, we haven't done much. Looking forward, 30 years from now, which is not really very long when you think about it. I'm not, there's not a guarantee I'll be here, but I hope I'll still be here in 2050. So this is during my lifetime. We're going to be starting to see impacts that we will look back on the rainstorms of 2020 and think that was the good old days. And I happen to have a 17-year-old daughter, and I look at this graph and I think, this is her whole life that she is going to be dealing with these challenges. So they're not there. These issues are no longer far away in the future. So how do we do that? Certainly, there are lots of things we can do on an individual basis to try to reduce emissions in our own lives. I think it's a good thing to do that. I think it helps to set the pace for people in other places and prove that it can be done without having to give up a high quality of life. But there is also truth that individual actions are not sufficient to bend that curve. We really need to see very strong leadership at the state level and and particularly at the federal level to begin addressing the emissions issues and ultimately at the global level, of course. So the main thing I always urge people to do is when you're thinking about voting, make climate change and the considerations around climate change a significant consideration in how you decide to vote, whoever that is for. And I think this is an issue that I'm hoping is increasingly not going to be a partisan issue because the impacts of this are not going to fall only on red states or blue states. It's going to impact all of us equally. So the next set of things, I think there is more that we can do at a local level to address. So one of the big challenges with the water aspect and some of the heat aspects of climate change is the way we've built our communities. And this is just a little aerial photo of, I think this is maybe the Westwood Station area, I'm not sure. But you can sort of see, how much we have modified the landscape, how much pavement we have created, how many areas we have created that are open pavement with no trees that do two things. One, they heat up And two, they cause water to run off, where water used to soak into the ground and now rushes off very quickly. And it has to get to what's left of the Neponset River, which is kind of running through the middle of the photo there. And of course, you know, when it runs off streets, it has to get into one of these. These are storm drains. These, you will find these undoubtedly in your neighborhood. They're all over the Neponset watershed. And they are basically inlets to the storm drain system that allow water that can't soak into the street to be carried away by a pipe. One of the, I think, strongest lessons of the rainstorms in Norwood is that it is almost impossible to contemplate designing a storm drainage system like this, a series of street inlets like this, that would have been able to take in all the rain that fell on Norwood. You know, so one of the real challenges here, and I mentioned that, you know, the flooding in Norwood, it was really a failure of the capacity of the storm drain system. It didn't really overwhelm the river because it was so small and short and concentrated, but it really did overwhelm the town's storm drain system. And of course, those storm drains lead through a pipe very quickly to a place like this. This is a storm drain outfall. And there are tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 storm drain inlets across the Neponset watershed in our 14 communities. And there's on the order of maybe 3,000 of these storm drain outfalls, places where pipes take that water off the street, whisk it very quickly to the pipe and discharge it with no water quality treatment. One of the big things we're focused on, and we're urging all of our communities to work on, is to rethink those storm drain systems. So to get away from that idea that, hey, the solution for all this water that can't soak into the ground anymore is just to send it to one of those storm drain inlets and shoot it off to the river as fast as possible. There's a whole set of techniques now that are generally referred to green infrastructure techniques or stormwater management techniques, where instead of having that very hard piped kind of fast acting system that's inevitably going to get overwhelmed in a large storm, you try to find ways to build in green features, places where you can send the water and temporarily hold it while it gets filtered through plants and soil and let it slow down before you try to push it into the storm drain system. And there's various ways you can do this. If you have a lot of space, you can do something like the previous picture, but even in very densely built areas, we can rethink the way we are designing our communities to use features like, you know, a row of trees by the sidewalk to both reduce our urban heat island effect and to capture and slow down and clean up that water. You know, and one of the observations here is in the storm event that Norwood had, you know, wouldn't it have been nice if we had designed features throughout downtown Norwood to make downtown Norwood greener, and that might have been able to hold back an inch of the 4 or 5 inches of rain that fell. Now that wouldn't completely solve the problem, but it would have allowed the engineered storm drain system to work much better if we could reduce the amount of water we were sending to it by 25% in that storm. And then, of course, you know, the other challenge with all of these practices is education and the process of trying to change people's expectations about what an urban streetscape looks like and how it works, and getting away from the traditional approach, which says that the solution to runoff from pavement is just to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The other thing we really need to do is towns have tremendous authority over the way their communities are built. In Massachusetts, towns are really the ones who regulate the design of private development. And most of the pavement in our communities, about 60% or more on average, is not owned by the town or by Mass Highway. It's owned by private parties. And we really need cities and towns to be more aggressive in the way they ask developers to design their sites. On the left here is a classic sort of big box retail situation, not a tree in sight. All the water is coming off this parking lot very quickly. And on the right is a different approach. We could have trees in the parking lot to give us shade to slow down the water. So towns really need to be thinking hard about looking at their zoning, their stormwater, their subdivision bylaws, and rethinking them in terms of climate change issues. Another issue is, we talked about how the big storms have gotten bigger. And one of the other things that we regulate in Massachusetts is we regulate development in the floodplain. And the floodplain is basically just the area along the sides of the river or along the sides of wetlands that accumulates water and floods during a flood. And this chart is showing in South Norwood. In the pink is showing the 100-year floodplain, which was mapped based on the rainfall data from the 1960s, so outdated rainfall data. So this is the area that we thought used to flood, which is regulated. So building is regulated inside that was quote unquote 100-year floodplain area, even though we know it's based on outdated rainfall. The 500-year floodplain is, we know now, given that we have more rain, the area that's going to flood, and the 500-year floodplain is not regulated. So another kind of change that we need to have in terms of how we're thinking about regulating development and redevelopment in our communities. Water use is another big challenge. Norwood is unusual. Most of the towns in the upper part of the Neponset watershed get their drinking from water from local sources. That means, in effect, they're sort of competing for the same water that the river needs to keep flowing during the summer. Norwood gets its drinking water from the Emdure system, which is probably the most robust potential source of drinking water available. The Emdure system and the storage they have is large enough that it could withstand a 5-year drought before they ran out of water. But in many communities, the way we're using water, keeping enormous lawns green for our convenience, there really is not enough water in a world of climate change for us to have both rivers that can function and support recreation and fish, and also some of the landscaping practices we've become accustomed to, and some of the choices about how we use water and where we source our water from. So that's an area, not so much for Norwood, but that many other communities really need to be thinking about. And it does influence, the river that people from Norwood will see passing through their town, even though Norwood is not directly affecting it. Another big challenge that comes with development is sort of the area along streams. In protecting those trout, one of the most important things we need to do is keep our rivers cold. And a natural stream, you've got trees and lots of shade. In many places in the watershed, we've allowed development and landscaping right up to the edge of the river. We really need to reestablish that shade and what's called the riparian habitat if we hope to have wildlife be able to continue to survive in our streams as things get hotter. Protecting floodplains. As I mentioned before, floodplains are the places where the water goes to sit once it's flooded. They're also very important wildlife habitats. There's a lot of places where we've built things in the floodplain that we probably shouldn't have. These are usually things that end up flooding a lot because they're built in the floodplain. And we're really going to need more floodplain space in the future to help hold on to and slow down those things. So protecting floodplains, and even in some cases trying to restore floodplains, pull historical development back out of the floodplains, is something we need to think about. Another big infrastructure challenge is dams, and this one is definitely a challenge in Norwood. Many people think of dams as being flood control measures, but there are about 100 dams on the Neponset and its tributaries, and only 2 of them are actually intentional flood control dams. Most of them are remnants of the industrial area, and they become a obstacle that floodwaters must get over when they start to come. And the real danger with dams is, in fact, that during a flood, the dam will fail because it's overwhelmed by the flood, and then all the water stored in the pond behind will be suddenly released. There's also tremendous ecological benefits of removing some of our unneeded dams to allow things like those native trout that want to be able to move up and downstream and get blocked by dams. So a big issue there, and a number of significant safety issues in Norwood with large dams that don't have the capacity to pass these increasingly large floods. Similar to dams, every time a road crosses a stream, there's a pipe that carries the stream under the road. In many cases, those pipes were not designed to handle even today's storm flows. And this is an example of a pipe that just got washed away by the stream during a flood, which is obviously bad for the stream. These are another challenge for aquatic life in the river, because they sort of break up the river and fish can't move upstream and downstream where they need to. But also, you could imagine if you were having an emergency and the hospital was on the other side of this culvert, it would be a big problem that it wasn't there anymore. So looking at our culverts and upgrading those, another big challenge. And then the last thing I'll mention is, I had alluded to things that have probably been built in places where they shouldn't have been built, that are going to be under greater and greater flood threat as time goes on. And this is a map of the Neponset River estuary downstream. Dorchester's on the left, Quincy's on the right. The river's obviously coming up through the middle. And this is the Mass Highway Department's estimate going out to 2070 of areas that are going to be flooded. And the thing I want to point out is this, I think you can see my pointer, is this building here. This is a very large building that is going to be completely underwater once a year or once every other year, 50 years from now. Not only is it completely underwater, but it's going to be completely on an island, because all the roads approaching it are going to be completely underwater. And it begs the question, with some of these things that are built in very vulnerable locations, does it make sense for society to invest tremendous amounts of money to armor those areas and build huge seawalls? Or are there some places we simply are going to need to pull back from and frankly restore to their historical condition? This particular spot used to be a salt marsh, and usually when you build something in a salt marsh, it's going to be flooded. So last but not least, in terms of specific things in Norwood, there are some specific things coming up that Norwood is looking at doing that we would urge everybody to support. One is at town meeting this fall. Norwood has a study of the drainage system for the middle of town that was prepared in 2004, I believe. It has largely been sitting on a shelf since then because there hasn't been a reason to focus on it. And the DPW is bringing forward an article to update that study and get started on designing some of its key recommendations so that they can hopefully be built in the next couple of years. And that's a great example of the kind of infrastructure upgrades that cities and towns need to be thinking of to get ready for climate change. In the spring, town meeting should be looking at a new stormwater bylaw to better regulate the stormwater that's generated when sites are developed or redeveloped. That's another really important opportunity for the town to think about. How do we need to design and build the town over the course of many years to come so that it is more flood resilient in the future? And then the last thing that may or may not be coming up for the town is the town has embarked on a study of something called a Stormwater Utility, which is an approach to funding stormwater infrastructure that we strongly encourage all of our municipalities to consider. Stormwater infrastructure is sort of the poor sister of drinking water and sewer infrastructure. Drinking water and sewer infrastructure, as I'm sure everybody here knows, are funded through sewer and water fees. It's a funding mechanism that's very predictable, allows the DPW to really know how much money they have coming in and to be able to plan and make long-term investments. In most communities, stormwater infrastructure is just a loose line item in the budget, competing with everything else from schools to cemetery to whatever you have. And that's historically has been a recipe for municipalities to neglect this infrastructure until they get hit with a big incident. A stormwater utility is an approach to, it's a fee-based approach to funding stormwater, where essentially instead of using tax money to fund stormwater infrastructure, you would establish a fee based on the amount of pavement that each parcel of land has. And it provides a much steadier, more consistent, more reliable way to fund and to plan the improvements that are going to be needed in the town's system. So the town is just starting to study the possibility of that. I'm sure there will be a lot more conversation about it in town, but it's definitely something we encourage towns to think about. The town of Milton did this a couple of years ago, and we've already seen them be able to do a lot of good work because they have access to this reliable funding source for their stormwater system. So, and last but not least, I'd just like to end with a picture of a young person. This person is actually an old picture. This person's probably 20 now. It's the daughter of one of our board members. But I do think, as we think about climate issues, one of the most important things we need to bear in mind is there's a generational equity issue about the choices we make now, perhaps more than ever before in human history. I mean, it sounds dramatic to say that, but it's true, are going to affect the ability of our children and our grandchildren to live a prosperous and healthy life. And I think, it's really, the time has really come for society to prioritize dealing with some of these issues. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer questions. If folks in the audience are welcome to follow up if we don't have time to get to all the questions tonight. The Watershed Association is an organization that works with lots of volunteers. If you're interested in volunteering, finding out more about what we do and how you can help, I encourage you to consider visiting our website, which is simply neponset.org. You can sign up for our free newsletter that'll keep you in the loop of what's going on. We'd love to have you as a volunteer. We'd love to have you as a member. It's very much a grassroots affair. So thank you. And if folks have questions, I'm happy to hang around and answer.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. I'm going to go ahead and give everybody the capability of unmuting themselves. So if you'd like to ask a question over the microphone, go ahead. Otherwise, definitely feel free to chat it out there.
Would you please tell us again what URL or whatever we can give friends and town meeting members we know and so forth, so that they can then watch this presentation we just had? You gave it at the beginning, but I didn't get it written down, and others may not have as well.
Do you know the answer to that, Liz?
The URL for your organization?
For where they can watch this video.
That's going to be put up by Norwood Community Media. Norwood Community Media does have their own website and I believe YouTube channel. And I believe they're also going to be putting it on the actual TV cable channel. So if somebody likes to tune in on the tube, they can do that.
Okay, thank you.
I just had a basic history question. How long has the Neponset River Watershed Association been working?
We have been around for a long time. We were incorporated in 1967, and we've actually been around since at least 1963, as far as I can tell. And it really, we were founded actually by members of the conservation commissions of many of the towns in the watershed, including, some people may know, Betty Cottrell, who was a longtime member of the Norwood Conservation Commission, was actually the secretary of the Watershed Association for many, many years. We still have her perfectly typed mimeographed minutes that she kept in the 60s and 70s.
And can you talk a little bit about the dam removal in Norwood off of Sumner Street?
Yes. So one of the projects we've been working on in Norwood is to remove the Mill Pond Dam, which is off of Sumner Street in Norwood near Peswick Park, if anybody's ever been over there, sort of behind Route 1 and behind kind of near the Walpole Mall. And this is a small pond that was likely built as a ice pond or just a recreational pond. It's on Trap Hole Brook, and Trap Hole Brook is without a doubt the best trout stream remaining in eastern Massachusetts. It's really quite amazing how robust it is. When the last time the state went out there and did their electrofishing to document the trout habitat, they found 118 fish, and every single one of them was a trout. So the pond has, over the years, it has silted in. It's only about a foot deep now. And it has a small dam, which is in very poor condition and is likely
I'm going to throw
fail
this phone away.
in the next flood. And so we've worked with the neighbors and the Conservation Commission and the DPW, and we're bringing forward a proposal. We're actually going through permitting right now to remove that dam and restore the stream. And that'll have a couple, aside from preventing it from failing during a flood and making the flood worse, it'll help to keep the brook cool by allowing there to be more shade over the brook, by avoiding the current situation where the water sort of spreads out and just sits in the pond and bakes in the sun. And also by allowing the fish to move more freely upstream and downstream, which is really a critical consideration for the survival of many forms of aquatic life, but certainly for trout. You know, as we face more drought issues, more flood issues, the fish need to be able to move around to find appropriate refuge areas so that they can weather the storm. When they're trapped in a short stretch of stream, it's very hard for them to survive. So we're hoping that we'll have permits in hand for that in the spring, and we'll be seeking filing some grant applications hopefully in the late spring. And if we're lucky, we will be doing a construction project there next fall.
Thank you. I think it's also important to note the work that the Trails Committee in town is doing to install a trail along the restored stream area through that park. It's a good hand-in-hand project.
Yes, definitely. Recreational benefits are definitely part of the package there.
I had a question about the stormwater infrastructure funding.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell me, how have you seen that done, and how frequently is it done? I love the idea. I'd love to hear more about general practice.
Sure. So it's, you know, this, and what we call this, we usually refer to this as a stormwater utility, or sometimes we refer to it as a stormwater enterprise fund. But basically the idea is we now have sufficient electronic mapping capabilities in the town and across the entire state now to be able to map, each individual parcel in the town, and to be able to identify how much of that parcel is so-called impervious surface, so pavement or rooftop or other surfaces that don't absorb water. And then you can structure a fee system that makes the fee for maintaining the stormwater system in proportion to the amount of pavement that each parcel is contributing to the system. And there's various ways to structure it. Oftentimes, for simplicity, where there's lots of very small residential parcels in a town, the town will use sort of a basic kind of average rate for small individual residential parcels, and then we'll charge a rate, the same effective rate, but charge a rate for other kinds of parcels like commercial properties that may have a lot of pavement or may just have a little, based on the actual amount of pavement, just to simplify the administration. And then it gets added on to a water bill or a sewer bill, or some places they send it as a separate bill. And the money collected all goes into an enterprise fund that can only be used to pay for the stormwater infrastructure. So it gives you, aside from a different kind of revenue source, it gives you very strong accountability and budgeting capability around that. And in most communities, the selectmen serve as stormwater commissioners and set the rates, and then the budget for the enterprise fund gets set at town meeting each year. It really works very much like water and sewer fees in most towns. And in the Neponset watershed, the only town that has implemented this so far is the town of Milton. But there are about, I think it's up to like 15 or 18 cities and towns in Massachusetts that have done this. So Braintree does this, Northampton, Reading, Newton, and I know there's others that I just can't think of at the moment. So it's becoming a more and more popular practice as communities are realizing, we really do need to have more consistent investment in our stormwater infrastructure. And this is both a fairer and more transparent and more predictable way to collect that revenue. And it's an idea that it's really an idea that started in other parts of the country. There's something like 4,500 stormwater utilities across the country as a whole. It's much more common in other parts of the country.
Great. And sorry, just one last question about that. What you've seen in other places, or maybe what they're doing in Milton, is it square footage of actual unpermeated surface, or is it as a percentage of the parcel?
It's generally square footage. So when you're setting the rates, really the kind of math behind setting the rates is you say, okay, what's the total amount of pavement in the entire town? There's 10 zillion square feet of pavement. And you say, okay, how much is our budget for the stormwater program this year? Just for the sake of argument, say it's $500,000 or $1 million. And you basically divide a million by how many ever square feet of pavement you have to figure out what's effectively the rate per square foot of pavement. And then the question becomes, how exactly does the town set it up? Because it is, Milton, I think when we did this exercise with Milton, they have either 5,000 or 7,000 parcels, and they didn't want to have to get into, debating with every single homeowner. Well, do you have, 100 square feet of pavement or 101 square feet? So for residential properties, what they did, which was most of their parcels, they sort of grouped them into to 4 tiers. So they said, okay, we'll see how much we can actually see on a spreadsheet how much pavement every single home has on their parcel across the whole town. And they said, okay, we'll take the lowest 25% has an average of, I don't know what the right answer is, but 1,000 square feet. And then the sizes from 25% to 50% have 1,500 square feet, and the next block has X hundred square feet. So rather than trying to charge every single person their exact square footage, they sort of put them into a group and say, we're going to charge you the average for, are you small, medium, or large, essentially. But the underlying fee is still based on that same rate. And then when it comes to commercial properties or other properties that tend to have more pavement or that tend to be more variable in terms of how much pavement they have, in Milton, they essentially do it just by the actual square feet. I think for Milton, they have maybe 1,000 parcels or 500 parcels that are sort of not simple homes. So it greatly simplifies the administration to do it that way.
Thank you so much for that.
Ian, we actually have a question in the chat. I'm going to read it aloud as well, but if you want to read along, you can. I've been reading about sustainable agriculture and how using compost and not weed killers can help improve the health of the soil, making it more spongy and able to hold more water. Do you think doing something like that in Norwood would help protect us a bit from future floods?
I definitely think it would. You know, it's interesting. For some reason in Massachusetts, you don't hear a lot about this kind of soil management and soil health as a stormwater management practice. You know, a lot of people think, oh, my lawn isn't paved, you know, all the water soaks in. And in fact, most lawns are really quite compacted. And there is actually a fair amount of runoff that will come off of a lawn depending on how things are sloped. And in other parts of the country, particularly the down in the sort of mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake area, you do hear them talking about quote unquote soil amendments for lawns to make them more porous and to give them more water retaining ability as a kind of recognized stormwater management practice. For some reason, maybe just because the state has not written that into our state stormwater handbook, you don't hear a lot about that, but it's definitely a legitimate thing to do that can be quite helpful.
Oh, and another chat question. How will our town meeting members get the information they need to make informed votes on these issues coming up this fall?
That is an excellent question. And honestly, I don't know. Of the issues I mentioned, the only one that is immediately coming up, as I understand it, for this fall town meeting, is the updating the 2004 so-called Meadowbrook drainage study, which really covers the center of town. So that's a pretty straightforward expenditure. I don't think and I don't think it's an enormous expenditure either. So I imagine the finance committee or your warrant committee is certainly going to be looking at that, and I imagine you will get information about it through the normal town meeting process. The stormwater bylaw and the possibility, and we don't even know if the town will decide they want to bring this forward, but the possibility of a stormwater utility in the spring are both things that are obviously going to need more discussion. And I would expect for the stormwater bylaw, I would guess, although I don't know, that it looks like the planning board is going to be the entity bringing that forward. And I would expect they would probably have some of their own public meetings talking about that, giving people a chance to have some input into the design of it. And then the stormwater utility, if the town does decide they want to move forward with that, I expect they are going to have a lot of conversation about it before it gets implemented, probably with some dedicated meetings. I don't know if that will be the selectmen bringing that forward or if it'll be the planning board or another board. But generally, that's creating a new fee is a big process, and most towns will make a pretty diligent effort to get people to have input into something like that.
I think we have a couple of town meeting members on the call tonight. I don't know if anybody else has more information about how information was distributed for the spring town meeting, but I imagine it might be along similar lines again for the fall. Susan says that she imagines it's time to contact our town meeting members on a personal one-to-one basis and invite them to view this video. Good idea. That will prepare them to examine the topic before it comes up in town meeting. Definitely share the word far and wide if you know anybody who might be interested or who does have a say at town meeting, because this apparently is an issue that is coming up on the docket. The video will be shared on the library's YouTube channel as well as Norwood Community Media. We are over the hour mark, so if anybody has any final questions, now is your time to ask. We'll release Ian.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This was excellent. And thanks everybody for taking time out of your evening to join us.